The ancient Persian gardens, known as pairi-daezos in Greek or pairi-daeza in Old Persian, represented far more than mere decorative spaces in the grand palaces of the Achaemenid Empire. The irrigation systems that sustained these elaborate gardens were particularly fascinating, especially when we consider the sophisticated water management techniques developed during the reign of Darius I, around 515 BCE. The primary method of delivering water throughout these extensive garden complexes involved a network of qanat systems, underground channels that transported water from aquifers across surprisingly long distances. In the gardens of Pasargadae, built under Cyrus the Great around 546 BCE, the main water channel measured approximately 2.5 meters wide, which seems rather excessive until we consider the remarkable story of the royal gardener Bargoas, who reportedly insisted on such width to accommodate the seasonal floods that occurred every spring when the snow melted in the distant Zagros mountains. Bargoas, according to rather dry administrative tablets found at the site, spent most of his mornings conducting careful inspections of the water flow rates, usually beginning his rounds at dawn when the air was still cool enough to properly assess water evaporation rates. The construction of these channels followed a rather methodical process that would typically begin with surveyors using rudimentary but surprisingly accurate leveling techniques involving water-filled hollow reeds. These surveyors would work in teams of 3 or 4, carefully marking the gradient of the land with small stone markers, many of which can still be found today, though most people simply walk past them without noticing their historical significance. The actual digging of the channels would then proceed at a rate of approximately 3 meters per day, with workers using bronze and iron tools that required regular maintenance and sharpening, typically performed every third day by specialized metalworkers who maintained workshops near the construction sites. The distribution of water throughout the garden was controlled through an intricate system of small gates and valves, many of which were operated by a specific class of servants known as the abdar, or water keepers. These individuals would begin their daily routines well before sunrise, adjusting the flow rates according to a complex schedule that took into account factors such as the time of year, the types of plants in different sections of the garden, and even the predicted weather patterns. One particularly dedicated abdar named Artabanus left detailed clay tablet records of his daily routines from around 490 BCE, including rather mundane notes about which sections of the garden received water on which days and how many times he had to clear debris from the channels. The water management system also incorporated several large storage basins, typically lined with carefully prepared lime mortar mixed with crushed pottery shards, a technique that produced a remarkably durable, waterproof surface. These basins served multiple purposes, including the rather practical function of allowing sediment to settle before the water was distributed to the more delicate portions of the garden. The largest of these basins at Persepolis measured approximately 15 meters across and was deep enough that during one rather unusual incident in 481 BCE, a young noble reportedly fell in while attempting to retrieve his dropped wine cup during an evening gathering, though fortunately the shallow depth and numerous nearby servants prevented any serious consequence. The actual distribution of water to individual plants involved a fascinating system of clay pipes and channels that branched out from the main waterways like the veins of a leaf. These pipes were manufactured in standardized lengths of approximately 60 centimeters, with slightly tapered ends that fit together rather precisely. The clay used in their production was carefully selected from specific deposits along the riverside, then mixed with finely chopped straw and shaped using wooden molds before being fired in kilns at temperatures that modern analysis suggests reached around 800 degrees Celsius. A rather dedicated potter named Mithridates, who worked during the reign of Xerxes I, left records of producing over 12,000 such pipes during his career, though he seems to have been particularly concerned with documenting the number of pipes that cracked during firing, apparently to justify his material usage to palace administrators. The social organization of Safavid Palace Gardens was remarkably intricate, with a hierarchical structure that developed gradually from around 1501 when Shah Ismail I established the dynasty. The head gardener, known as the Sarbagban, held a position of considerable prestige, though perhaps not quite as prestigious as you might imagine, as they were routinely outranked by the royal food taster and the keeper of the Shah's slippers. In 1583, we find records of a particularly dedicated Sarbagban named Mahmud, who spent 43 years maintaining the gardens at Isfahan, though he was apparently quite upset about being seated below the royal falcon keeper at formal ceremonies. The daily routine of garden workers followed a rather predictable pattern, with the junior apprentices arriving shortly before dawn to begin their tasks. These young workers, some as young as 12, would spend their early morning hours sweeping fallen petals from the pathways and checking the intricate irrigation channels for blockages. There was a fascinating incident in 1612 when an apprentice named Yasir discovered a family of ducks had taken up residence in one of the water channels, but rather than disturb them, the garden staff simply redirected the water flow through a secondary channel for 3 weeks until the ducklings were old enough to waddle away. The middle ranks of garden workers included the specialized pruners, known as gulchin, who were responsible for maintaining the geometric precision of the ornamental shrubs and fruit trees. These workers developed their skills over many years, often spending up to 7 years as apprentices before being allowed to touch the more prestigious plants. In 1634, there was quite a stir when a gulchin named Hassan was demoted to pond maintenance after accidentally pruning a beloved apricot tree into the shape of what some claimed resembled an unflattering caricature of the Shah's mother. The water management specialists, or mirab, occupied a curious position in the garden hierarchy. While technically subordinate to the Sarbagban, they often wielded considerable informal power due to their crucial role in maintaining the garden's lifeblood. These workers needed to understand complex mathematical principles to ensure proper water flow through the various channels and fountains. They would begin their calculations each morning by measuring water levels using copper vessels of standardized sizes, a process that could take up to 3 hours if performed with appropriate thoroughness. Around midday, when the sun was highest, most garden workers would retreat to shaded areas to take their main meal and rest. This practice was formalized in 1589 by Shah Abbas I, who declared that working in the direct sunlight between noon and 3 in the afternoon was detrimental to the proper maintenance of royal plants. During these rest periods, more experienced workers would often share their knowledge with apprentices, teaching them to distinguish between various soil types by smell and texture, a practice that continues in some Iranian gardens to this day. The specialized rose cultivators, or gulabchi, maintained their own distinct hierarchy within the garden staff. These workers were responsible for maintaining the extensive rose gardens that produced petals for rose water, an essential component in both cuisine and court ceremonies. In 1645, a particularly skilled gulabchi named Fatima became the first woman to be officially recognized in the court records as a master of rose cultivation, though unofficial accounts suggest women had been quietly managing rose gardens for generations before this. The management of labor in these gardens involved an intricate system of rotation, with workers moving between different sections of the garden according to a schedule that changed with the seasons. During the spring months, when the gardens required the most attention, workers would be organized into teams of 7, each responsible for a specific garden quarter. These teams would rotate clockwise through the garden sections every 14 days, a practice that was believed to prevent workers from becoming too emotionally attached to particular plants or garden features. The administrative aspects of garden management were handled by a separate class of workers known as the daftar dan, or record keepers. These individuals maintained detailed logs of plant maintenance, worker assignments, and tool inventories. A particularly thorough daftar dan named Ibrahim, who served from 1623 to 1651, left behind 17 volumes of garden records, including rather unnecessary details such as the exact number of rose petals collected each day and the names of every sparrow that regularly visited the garden's eastern quarter. The transfer of knowledge between generations of garden workers followed established protocols that combined practical instruction with philosophical teachings. Senior gardeners were expected to share not only technical skills but also poetry and religious teachings related to the spiritual significance of garden maintenance. In 1592, a senior gardener named Karim was temporarily suspended from his duties for failing to properly instruct his apprentices in the correct verses to recite while pruning pomegranate trees, an oversight that was considered quite serious at the time. The garden workers' hierarchy also included specialized tool maintainers, who held a surprisingly elevated status due to their responsibility for preserving and caring for the often expensive and elaborate gardening implements. These tools, some of which were decorated with semi-precious stones and intricate metalwork, required regular maintenance using specific oils and polishing techniques. The chief tool maintainer would inspect each implement every Friday afternoon, a process that could take up to 4 hours if performed with appropriate diligence, which it usually wasn't. The social dynamics among garden workers were further complicated by the presence of visiting specialists, particularly during the reign of Shah Abbas II in the mid-1600s. These visiting experts, often brought in from distant provinces or even foreign lands, would temporarily disrupt the established hierarchy while sharing new techniques or introducing exotic plants. In 1658, a visiting gardener from Kashmir caused quite a stir by suggesting that the traditional method of watering orange trees was entirely incorrect, leading to a rather passive-aggressive debate that lasted several months and was eventually resolved by allowing both watering methods to be used on different trees, though nobody bothered to record which method proved more effective. The symbolic placement of plants in Persian palace gardens was governed by an intricate system of meanings that developed gradually over several centuries, with particularly detailed records surviving from the Safavid period around 1501. The cypress trees, which you might find rather interesting if you're still awake, were invariably planted along the northern walls to provide shade during the warmest parts of the afternoon, typically around 2 p.m., when the court officials would often take their diplomatic meetings in the garden pavilions. These cypress trees held deep religious significance, their eternal green representing the perpetual nature of paradise, though the gardeners mostly concerned themselves with keeping them properly trimmed to maintain the correct height of approximately 47 feet. In 1423, during the renovation of the gardens at the Palace of 40 Columns in Isfahan, the chief gardener Ahmad ibn Mahmud wrote a rather tedious 17-page document detailing the exact positioning requirements for rose bushes, which needed to be planted in groups of 7, as 7 represented divine perfection. The roses themselves required daily attention, with gardeners beginning their work at dawn, usually around 5:30 a.m., to remove any damaged petals and check for signs of disease or pest infestation. There was one particularly fascinating incident in 1426 when a gardener named Rashid accidentally planted 8 roses in a group instead of 7, leading to a 3-month investigation and the writing of 4 additional documents about proper rose placement protocols. The pomegranate trees, which held tremendous symbolic importance, were always situated along the eastern pathways, their fruit representing fertility and abundance. Each morning, around 7 a.m., specialized fruit tenders would inspect every pomegranate, maintaining detailed records of their growth in lengthy scrolls that were stored in the palace library. One such scroll, discovered in 1892, contained over 3,000 individual pomegranate observations, including rather mundane details such as slight yellowing on lower left leaf and small indentation on northwestern face of fruit number 247. Moving on to the placement of herbs, which follows naturally from our discussion of fruit trees, we find that the medieval Persian garden designers developed an extraordinarily complex system for arranging medicinal and culinary plants. Sweet basil, for instance, needed to be planted in precise geometric patterns that aligned with the movement of the sun throughout the day. The palace records tell us of one particularly dedicated gardener, Kamal al-Din, who spent 47 years, from 1398 to 1445, perfecting the arrangement of herb gardens in the palace of Shiraz. He wrote a rather soporific treatise titled On the Proper Alignment of Aromatic Herbs in Relation to Solar Positions, which ran to some 812 pages. The water features, which were integral to both the practical and symbolic aspects of these gardens, required careful consideration in relation to plant placement. Lotus flowers, for example, needed to be positioned in pools that received exactly 4.5 hours of direct sunlight each day. The placement of these pools was calculated using sophisticated astronomical tools, though the actual daily maintenance was considerably more mundane, involving regular cleaning of debris and the occasional removal of accidentally fallen fruit from nearby trees. In 1467, there was quite an incident when a particularly large pomegranate fell into a lotus pool, causing a small splash that dampened a visiting diplomat's robes, though everyone was very polite about it and pretended not to notice. The arrangement of flowering shrubs followed strict hierarchical principles, with the most symbolically significant plants, such as jasmine and lilac, being planted closest to the central pavilion. These shrubs required daily pruning, which was carried out by a team of specialized gardeners who would begin their work precisely at sunrise, following a methodical pattern that had been established sometime in the late 13th century. The head gardener would carry a rather large book of regulations, approximately 200 pages in length, which detailed the exact angle at which each branch should be trimmed and the proper disposal method for the clippings, which were often used in the palace perfumery. The placement of fruit trees held particular political significance, with certain species being reserved for areas where foreign diplomats would be received. Orange trees, for instance, were carefully positioned to provide both shade and pleasant fragrance during diplomatic meetings, which typically occurred between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The trees needed to be tall enough to provide adequate shade, but not so tall as to block the view of the palace architecture, leading to the development of specialized pruning techniques that would be passed down through generations of royal gardeners. One such technique, developed by a gardener named Mustafa in 1512, involved the use of a particular type of curved blade that had to be sharpened precisely every third day during the growing season. The symbolic importance of plant placement extended even to the smallest details, such as the spacing between individual tulip bulbs, which had to be planted exactly 7.5 inches apart to represent the 7 heavens of Islamic cosmology, with the half-inch representing the earthly realm. These measurements were taken quite seriously, and there exist numerous records of gardeners being disciplined for improper spacing, including one rather amusing incident in 1489 when a junior gardener was found to have used the wrong measuring stick and had to replant an entire section of tulips. A task that took approximately 14 hours and required the assistance of 3 other gardeners, all of whom had to carefully document their work in the official garden records. The integration of garden pavilions into Persian palace architecture reached its height during the Safavid period when Shah Abbas I commissioned the remarkable Chahar Bagh pavilions in Isfahan around 1598. These pavilions, which might seem rather straightforward at first glance, actually required quite specific architectural considerations regarding their placement within the greater garden complex. The builders had to account for the angle of the sun throughout the day, you see, as well as the prevailing winds that would carry the scent of roses and jasmine through the carefully positioned archways. The standard pavilion typically featured a central domed chamber, though I recall reading about an unusual octagonal variation built in 1423 by a rather particular nobleman named Mirza Sharok, who insisted that 8 sides would better accommodate the various astronomical alignments he was rather obsessed with. His pavilion unfortunately collapsed during a rather mild earthquake some decades later, which rather proved the point about traditional four-sided designs being more structurally sound. The typical square pavilion had four iwans, or vaulted spaces, opening onto the four quarters of the garden, creating what we might call a rather pleasant cross breeze on warm afternoons. Speaking of afternoons, it was customary for diplomatic meetings to be held in these garden pavilions around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, after the main meal of the day. The Portuguese ambassador Thomas Herbert wrote quite extensively about one such meeting in 1627, though his account spends an inordinate amount of time describing the various types of sherbet being served rather than the actual diplomatic discussions taking place. He did mention that the ceramic cups used for serving these refreshments were made in a particular workshop in Kashan, where the master potter would spend approximately 47 days creating each set of ceremonial vessels, firing them precisely 3 times at different temperatures. The entertainment aspects of these pavilions were really quite fascinating in their mundane details. Court musicians would position themselves in specific alcoves designed to enhance acoustics, though there was one rather amusing incident in 1588 when a court chronicler recorded that a particularly enthusiastic tambourine player became so absorbed in his performance that he backed right into one of the garden's water channels. The integration of water features with the pavilion architecture was actually quite sophisticated, with narrow channels running through the floor of many pavilions, providing both cooling effects and pleasant ambient sounds. The maintenance of these water systems required a dedicated staff of water engineers, or mirab, who would spend their mornings checking the various levels and adjustments of the water flow. During the reign of Shah Tahmasp, around 1560 or so, there was a rather particular head gardener named Hassan who developed an elaborate system for rotating the placement of potted plants within the pavilion based on their blooming schedules. He kept meticulously boring records of when each plant should be moved, writing things like, "The white jasmine pot must be shifted 3 feet to the left of the northern archway every 3rd Tuesday, unless it falls during Ramadan, in which case wait until Thursday." These records survived and provide us with rather detailed insights into the day-to-day operations of palace garden maintenance. The pavilions also served as settings for poetry recitations, which could go on for rather extended periods. There's a somewhat tedious account from 1612 of a poetry competition that lasted for nearly 14 hours, during which time the contestants had to compose verses about each individual flower variety in the garden while maintaining proper metre and rhyme. The winner, a poet named Mahmud, apparently created a particularly moving piece about the proper spacing between iris bulbs, which was later inscribed on a wall panel that still exists today, though it's mostly faded and rather difficult to read now. The architectural integration of these pavilions with the surrounding garden elements followed precise mathematical principles based on the ancient concept of sacred geometry. The distance between supporting columns would be calculated using a complex formula involving the golden ratio and the average growth height of local cypress trees. The master architect would spend several weeks just measuring and remeasuring these distances, often in the early morning hours when the air was still cool enough to avoid any thermal expansion of their measuring tools, which were typically made of brass and could be affected by temperature changes of even a few degrees. One particularly interesting aspect of these pavilions was their role in astronomical observations. Small openings in the domes were positioned to align with specific celestial events, though this sometimes led to rather unexpected consequences. In 1634, during an important diplomatic reception, a sudden shaft of sunlight through one of these openings apparently startled a visiting Ottoman ambassador so thoroughly that he spilled his sherbet all over his elaborate robes. The incident was smoothed over when the Persian host explained the astronomical significance of the alignment, leading to an impromptu lecture on celestial mathematics that apparently lasted well into the evening and resulted in several trade agreements being signed, possibly just to bring the lecture to an end. The seasonal rotation of plants in Persian palace gardens required immense coordination throughout the year, with gardeners beginning their preparations for each season approximately 6 weeks before the anticipated changes. In the royal gardens of Shah Abbas I around 1598, we find fascinating records of how head gardener Mahmud al-Kumi would carefully orchestrate the replacement of fading spring tulips with summer roses, ensuring there was never a moment when the garden appeared bare or transitional. The process typically began at dawn, with teams of gardeners removing spent blooms while others prepared new beds with a special soil mixture containing equal parts garden loam, decomposed sheep manure, and river sand. During the warmer months, the fruit trees required particular attention, and we have rather detailed accounts from 1612 describing how the gardeners would carefully thin the developing fruits to ensure the remaining specimens grew to the impressive sizes expected in a royal garden. Each peach tree, for instance, would be limited to bearing no more than 60 fruits, with workers measuring the spacing between fruits, using their thumb width as a standard unit of measurement. This practice continues today in many traditional Persian gardens, though the modern thumb measurement has been standardized to approximately 2.8 centimeters. The movement of potted plants was another crucial aspect of maintaining year-round visual appeal. In the gardens of Shiraz around 1489, records indicate that more than 300 large ceramic planters were kept in underground storage chambers, ready to be brought out as needed to replace plants that had finished their seasonal display. These storage chambers, known as sardabs, maintained a constant temperature of around 15 degrees Celsius, allowing gardeners to delay or accelerate the blooming of various species by moving them between the cool storage and the warm garden environment. One particularly dedicated gardener, Hassan ibn Yazid, reportedly spent so much time in these chambers that he developed an unusual ability to predict when plants would bloom based solely on the subtle changes in their leaf texture. The coordination of flowering times was achieved through careful observation and recording of plant behavior over many generations. Garden journals from the mid-15th century show detailed notes about which varieties of iris could be forced into early bloom by placing their rhizomes in warmed sand, and which varieties of rose could be delayed by careful pruning and placement in shaded areas. The gardeners developed a remarkable system of rotating plants through different light exposures, creating what they called the dance of the flowers, where blooms would appear to move through the garden in choreographed waves of colour throughout the growing season. In the palace gardens of Isfahan around 1678, we find records of an elaborate system of mobile shade structures that could be adjusted to protect delicate plants from the intense afternoon sun. These structures, made from finely woven silk and linen panels, were mounted on cedar poles and moved throughout the day by a dedicated team of shade keepers who followed the sun's path. The head shade keeper, one Muhammad al-Razi, held this position for an impressive 43 years and was known for his ability to predict exactly when each type of plant would need protection based on the angle of the sun and the time of year. The maintenance of fruit trees presented its own set of seasonal challenges. In early spring, around 1542, records show that palace gardeners would begin the delicate process of grafting new varieties onto existing trees. This practice allowed them to create trees that would bear multiple varieties of fruits, with some specimens producing up to 7 different types of apples or 5 varieties of plums on a single tree. The grafting process required such precision that apprentice gardeners would practice for 3 years on common trees before being allowed to work on the palace specimens. One particularly talented grafter, Yusuf al-Shirazi, became so renowned for his skill that he was sent as a diplomatic gift to the Ottoman court, where he reportedly created a pomegranate tree that bore both sweet and sour fruits on alternate branches. The rotation of flowering plants required careful attention to soil fertility, and palace gardens maintained extensive composting operations that would impress even modern organic gardeners. Kitchen waste from the palace was carefully sorted and combined with specific types of animal manure, each chosen for its particular properties. Pigeon manure, being rich in nitrogen, was reserved for leafy plants and lawn areas, while sheep manure was preferred for flowering plants due to its balanced nutrient content. The composting areas were typically located in the far corners of the garden, hidden behind decorative screens covered in climbing roses and jasmine, creating the illusion that the garden's beauty emerged spontaneously rather than through careful cultivation. Water management played a crucial role in maintaining continuous blooms throughout the year. The gardens employed a sophisticated system of underground channels called qanats, which were adjusted seasonally to provide different areas of the garden with varying amounts of water. During the height of summer, around 1634, records indicate that the water flow would be adjusted up to 8 times per day, with certain channels being opened or closed to direct water to different plant groups based on their specific needs. The sound of running water was considered as important as the visual display, and gardeners would adjust the flow rates to create different musical notes as the water passed through specially designed ceramic channels and fountains. The selection and placement of plants was guided by both aesthetic and practical considerations. Tall plants were positioned to create shade for more delicate specimens, while strongly scented flowers were carefully spaced to prevent their fragrances from overwhelming each other. The gardeners developed detailed knowledge of plant compatibility, understanding which species would enhance each other's growth and which needed to be kept separate. This knowledge was passed down through generations of gardeners, often in the form of poetic verses that encoded practical information about plant care within their metaphorical language. The meticulous documentation of Persian palace gardens fell primarily to the Boston Nama writers, who would spend their days carefully recording every detail of the royal grounds, often beginning their work shortly after dawn prayers. In 1423, during the reign of Shahrukh Mirza, we find particularly detailed accounts from a chronicler named Mahmud ibn Ahmad, who developed an intricate system of recording plant locations using a grid pattern divided into sections he called paradise squares. The rather mundane process involved measuring each bed with knotted ropes, though on one occasion the rope measurements were temporarily disrupted when a wandering peacock became entangled in them. The Bostan Nama writers would typically position themselves in elevated pavilions during the cooler morning hours, sketching rough layouts of the garden beds while consulting with the chief gardener about recent plantings. They used a fascinating variety of inks derived from local materials. The deep brown ink came from walnut husks gathered in the very gardens they were documenting, while the vivid green ink was crafted from copper verdigris, though this particular ink had an unfortunate tendency to eat through the paper over time, causing numerous preservation challenges for modern archivists. One particularly dedicated chronicler, Hassan al-Shirazi, worked in the gardens of Isfahan around 1567 and developed an elaborate classification system for recording the seasonal changes of various plants. He would note the precise day when each variety of rose first bloomed, though his otherwise meticulous records were occasionally interrupted by complaints about persistent ankle pain and the quality of his writing quills. His system involved dividing the garden into 12 sections corresponding to the months of the Persian calendar, with detailed inventories of which plants would be in bloom during each period. Rather amusingly, he once documented an entire section of tulips that turned out to be elaborate ceramic replicas installed by a previous garden master during a particularly harsh growing season. The preservation of these garden documents required careful attention to environmental conditions. The records were typically stored in specially constructed cedar chests lined with silk and treated with essential oils of neem and camphor to deter insects. Every third Tuesday, the documents would be carefully removed and aired in the shade, though never in direct sunlight, which could fade the precious inks. There's a rather tedious account from 1612 describing how one archive keeper, Yusuf ibn Mahmud, spent 14 years developing the perfect mixture of aromatic preservatives, only to have his formula accidentally washed away when a well-meaning apprentice cleaned his workshop during a brief illness. The actual process of recording new plantings followed a rather rigid protocol. The Bostan Nama writer would first create a preliminary sketch using a light wash of saffron-based ink, which would fade away over time, allowing the final documentation to be written over it in more permanent inks. They would note not only the location and variety of each plant, but also rather mundane details such as the direction the gardener faced while planting, the phase of the moon, and even the particular tools used for each task. One especially thorough chronicler in 1589 went so far as to record the number of individual pomegranate seeds planted in each location, though this level of detail was generally considered excessive even by the standards of the time. The documentation of water features required particular attention, as the complex system of channels and fountains could change seasonally. Writers would carefully note the depth and flow rate of each channel, often using poetic metaphors that, while beautiful, could be rather confusing for practical purposes. In 1544, one writer described a particular fountain as flowing with the gentleness of a maiden's tears, which, while evocative, proved rather unhelpful when engineers needed to repair it several decades later. The Boston Nama writers also maintained detailed records of the garden's wildlife, though these observations were often interwoven with rather practical concerns. They would note the nesting habits of various birds, the activities of beneficial insects, and occasionally the presence of unwanted guests such as wild cats or wandering deer. One rather unfortunate incident in 1632 involved a chronicler becoming so absorbed in documenting a family of nightingales that he failed to notice an approaching royal procession and was nearly trampled by the Shah's favourite horse. The preservation of these records faced numerous challenges over the centuries. The practice of storing documents in underground chambers while protecting them from the heat sometimes led to problems with humidity. In 1678, an entire collection of garden documents was nearly lost when an unusually heavy rain caused flooding in the storage vaults of Shiraz. The documents were saved through the rather tedious process of individually drying each page over small braziers of chamomile and lavender, a process that took nearly 3 months and reportedly left the entire archive staff smelling rather pleasantly for weeks afterward. The actual writing implements used by the Boston Nama writers were themselves subjects of careful consideration. The finest reed pens were harvested from specific marshlands during particular phases of the moon, then cured for exactly 40 days in a mixture of salt and aromatic herbs. The preparation of these pens was considered so important that some gardens employed specialized penmasters who did nothing else. One such master, working in the gardens of Kerman in 1591, reportedly spent 2 years perfecting a specific cut of reed pen that would allow for the precise rendering of cypress tree shapes in the garden plans, though sadly none of these special pens have survived to the present day. The influence of Zoroastrian beliefs on Persian palace gardens becomes particularly evident when we examine the ritualistic aspects of garden maintenance during the pre-Islamic period, around 600 BCE. The gardeners would begin their daily tasks by facing east toward the rising sun, as was customary in Zoroastrian practice. This seemingly simple orientation actually stemmed from a complex theological understanding of light as the manifestation of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord in Zoroastrian tradition. The garden workers would carefully tend to the 4-quartered design known as the Chahar Bagh, which represented the 4 sacred elements of water, earth, fire, and air. Rather fascinating, though hardly discussed in modern texts, is how the head gardener, known as the Bagban, would methodically inspect each quadrant while reciting specific prayers from the Avesta. There's a rather drowsy account from around 522 BCE of a Bagban named Artadatta, who reportedly spent 3 hours every morning just walking the pathways, ensuring no dead leaves remained to corrupt the purity of the space. The maintenance of water features held particular significance, as water was considered one of the primary sacred elements. The gardeners would clean the channels every 3rd day, using special bronze tools that had been blessed by Zoroastrian priests. These tools were stored in a dedicated structure called the Abzar Kadeh, which had to be kept meticulously clean. In fact, there's a rather tedious record from around 515 BCE describing how one gardener spent an entire afternoon organizing 127 different maintenance tools according to their ritual significance. The placement of plants themselves followed strict Zoroastrian principles regarding purity and light. Evergreen trees, particularly cypress and pine, were planted along the northern edges of the gardens because they were thought to harbour beneficial spirits called fravashis. The gardeners would trim these trees only during specific phases of the moon, following a complex calendar system that somehow managed to combine practical horticultural knowledge with religious observance. One particularly meticulous record keeper, whose name was unfortunately smudged but might have been Mehrabad, documented the precise timing of every cypress trimming for 23 years, noting that the optimal time was typically between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning. The influence of Zoroastrian fire temples on garden maintenance cannot be overlooked, though it often is by modern scholars who tend to focus on the more obvious water features. Small fire altars were maintained in specific corners of the garden, requiring daily attention from specially trained attendants. These firekeepers, or athravan, would coordinate their activities with the garden staff, leading to some rather interesting scheduling conflicts. There's a mildly amusing account from around 500 BCE of an ongoing dispute between a particularly zealous firekeeper and a head gardener regarding the proper time to prune the pomegranate trees near the sacred fire. The selection and placement of flowering plants followed an intricate system based on their relationship to various Zoroastrian angels, or yazatas. Red roses, for instance, were associated with Mithra, the yazata of contracts, and the rising sun, and thus had to be planted in eastern-facing beds. The gardeners maintained detailed records of which flowers bloomed when, creating what must have been rather monotonous scrolls of botanical observations mixed with religious annotations. One such scroll, discovered in the ruins of a palace near Persepolis, contains over 300 entries about the proper ritual care of jasmine plants alone. The daily routine of garden maintenance would begin before sunrise, with the first task being the cleaning of the water channels. This had to be completed before the morning prayers could commence, as the sound of flowing water was considered essential to proper worship. The head gardener would typically assign tasks according to a rotating schedule that took into account both the physical demands of the work and the spiritual purity requirements of different garden zones. Young apprentice gardeners would spend their first year simply learning the correct prayers and purification rituals before being allowed to touch any plants. Rather interesting, though delivered in countless dry lectures, is the story of a gardener named Rashna, who in 534 BCE apparently spent 3 months creating a detailed map of how the shadow of the central palace fell across different plants throughout the day. This was done to ensure that no ritually significant plant was ever completely deprived of sunlight, which was considered a form of spiritual neglect. The map itself has been lost to time, but several tediously detailed descriptions of it survive in administrative records. The maintenance of fruit trees required particularly complex ritual observations. Before any fruit could be harvested, the trees had to be circled 3 times by a gardener reciting specific verses from the Avesta. Tools used for pruning had to be purified with special prayers and ritual washings between uses on different species of trees. There's a rather long and detailed account of how one unfortunate gardener in 528 BCE had to repeat an entire day's worth of pruning because he accidentally used a pomegranate-designated tool on an apple tree. The influence of Zoroastrian elements extended even to the timing of routine tasks like weeding and soil preparation. These activities were scheduled according to a complex calendar that took into account both practical agricultural considerations and religious observances. The gardeners would consult astronomical tables to determine the most auspicious times for various tasks, leading to what must have been rather complicated work schedules. One particularly detailed record from around 510 BCE describes how the head gardener had to reorganize an entire month's maintenance routine because of an unexpected eclipse, which was considered an inauspicious omen for certain types of garden work. The presence of animals in the garden was also carefully regulated according to Zoroastrian principles. Certain birds were considered beneficial and were actively encouraged through the placement of specific plants and water features. Peacocks, in particular, were viewed as sacred creatures and were allowed to roam freely through the gardens. The gardeners maintained special feeding areas for these birds, which had to be cleaned and replenished according to specific ritual requirements. There's a rather dull but detailed account of how one gardener spent 2 weeks creating a perfect peacock feeding station, only to have it rejected by the resident birds, who preferred to eat near the rose bushes instead. The development of specialized gardening tools during the Qajar period, particularly between 1785 and 1833, represented a fascinating convergence of traditional Persian horticultural knowledge and innovative metallurgical techniques. The master gardener Muhammad Ali Shirazi, who served in the palace gardens of Tehran, developed a particularly interesting pruning implement called the Golchin-e-Shah, or Royal Flower Selector, which featured a curved bronze blade with small ridges designed specifically for maintaining the delicate stems of Persian roses without damaging their thorns, which were considered an essential aspect of the plant's natural beauty. The careful maintenance of these tools became something of an obsession among palace gardeners, who would spend approximately 3 hours each evening cleaning and oiling their implements. They stored these precious tools in specialized wooden boxes lined with lamb's wool, and rather intriguingly would often place dried apricots alongside the metal tools, as it was believed the fruit's natural oils would help prevent rust, though modern metallurgists would likely question the scientific basis of this practice. One particularly dedicated gardener, Hussein Kazvini, reportedly spent so much time polishing his tools that he wore through 17 pairs of leather gloves in a single season, leading to a minor adjustment in the palace's annual budget for gardening supplies. The development of irrigation techniques specific to palace gardens led to the creation of the Ab-Pashe Motaram, a remarkably precise watering device made from copper and brass that allowed gardeners to control water flow to individual plant specimens. This innovation came about after an unfortunate incident in 1802 when an overzealous apprentice gardener flooded a bed of rare tulips imported from Istanbul, causing considerable diplomatic embarrassment when the Ottoman ambassador came to view them the following week. The incident, while rather mundane in the grand scheme of things, led to significant improvements in water management throughout Persian palace gardens. The tools for soil preparation were particularly specialized, with the qanbil, a type of spade designed specifically for working with the unique soil composition of palace gardens, which typically consisted of carefully balanced mixtures of local earth, river silt, and decomposed organic matter from the palace kitchens. The handle of the qanbil was set at a precise 42-degree angle to reduce back strain during the long hours of soil preparation that typically began around 4:30 in the morning during the summer months. A rather drowsy court chronicler named Mirza Asghar noted in his journals that the sound of gardeners preparing soil in the pre-dawn hours served as a rather reliable alarm clock for the palace inhabitants, though he complained that it interfered with his attempts to sleep late on Fridays. The practice of propagating plants required its own set of specialized tools, including the rather ingenious shark bore, a grafting knife with a blade made from Damascus steel, which maintained its edge so effectively that some examples discovered in palace collections from 1825 are still sharp enough to cut paper. The palace gardeners developed a detailed schedule for grafting operations, with different species being grafted at specific times of day, according to traditional beliefs about the movement of sap in relation to the sun's position. These beliefs were carefully recorded in a fascinating manual written by head gardener Ibrahim Tabriz in 1817, though unfortunately several pages were later damaged when his grandson accidentally spilled pomegranate juice on the manuscript while enjoying an afternoon snack in the garden library. The maintenance of larger trees and shrubs led to the development of the shajar band, a complex system of adjustable copper rings and silk ropes used to train branches into desired shapes. This system was particularly important for maintaining the characteristic forms of cypress trees, which featured prominently in palace gardens as symbols of eternal life and royal authority. The installation of a shajar band system could take up to 6 days to complete properly, and garden apprentices were required to practice for months on dead branches before being allowed to work with living specimens. One particularly memorable incident occurred in 1829 when a newly appointed gardener attempted to rush the process and managed to bend an ancient cypress into such an unusual shape that it became something of a tourist attraction, though the head gardener was reportedly less than amused by this accidental innovation. The tools used for harvesting flowers and fruits were perhaps the most specialized of all, with different implements designed for each type of bloom and fruit. The gold chin, for instance, came in 17 different sizes, each calibrated for specific flower types, while the Maiva chin featured adjustable grip pressure to prevent bruising of delicate fruits. These tools were typically manufactured by a single family of craftsmen in Isfahan, who held their techniques so secret that when the last master craftsman of the line caught a cold in 1831 and was briefly bedridden, the palace gardens had to suspend certain harvesting activities until he recovered, leading to a rather amusing situation where several courtiers were seen attempting to pick flowers with their bare hands, much to the horror of the professional gardening staff. The careful placement of aromatic plants in Persian palace gardens followed intricate systems developed around 1380 by the royal gardener Mahmud al-Kashani, who spent approximately 47 years mapping the way different fragrances would drift through courtyards depending on the seasonal winds. During the morning hours, particularly around dawn, jasmine and roses were positioned to release their strongest perfumes, just as the royal family would take their breakfast in the Eastern Pavilion. Rather fascinating, really, how they would plant night-blooming flowers like evening primrose in concentric circles, calculating the precise distance needed for the scent to reach the evening gathering spaces by sunset. In 1412, there was a rather peculiar incident when Master Gardener Hassan ibn Yusuf accidentally planted particularly pungent garlic too close to the ceremonial receiving area, causing the visiting Byzantine ambassador to sneeze repeatedly during an important treaty signing. The poor fellow was quietly reassigned to tend the remote agricultural gardens near Kermanshah. The subsequent royal gardener, whose name I believe was Ahmad, developed a rather tedious but effective system of testing wind patterns using burning incense at different times of day, meticulously recording the movement of smoke across the courtyard in thick leather-bound journals, most of which were sadly lost during a minor flood in 1489. Though one partially survived and shows the most remarkably detailed diagrams of aromatics circulation patterns. And as we delve further into the shaded walkways of these ancient Persian gardens, we must consider the fascinating role of the muhtasib, a rather peculiar garden inspector who would measure the precise spacing between pomegranate trees in the early morning hours. Around 1432, during the reign of Shah Rukh, these inspectors began requiring gardeners to maintain exactly 12 handspans between each mature fruit tree, a measurement that caused no small amount of confusion as different gardeners naturally had different-sized hands. The documentation from this period tells us of one particularly zealous inspector named Mahmud al-Shirazi, who carried with him a measuring stick made from a sacred cedar tree, though this only added to the general befuddlement as his stick had mysteriously shrunk after being left out in the summer sun for several seasons. The entire bureaucratic system of garden measurement eventually had to be reformed in 1439, when they switched to using standardized rope lengths, which proved much more reliable, if somewhat less interesting to the palace cats who had developed a habit of playing with the dangling measuring ropes while the inspectors went about their rather tedious daily rounds.